Hey everyone, I hope you're well. This is the story about what if Naruto was a silent prodigy and joined Akatsuki. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel and like the video as well. So without any further ado, let's start the what if. Naruto jumped through the trees running at full speed while he and Kurama cursed in perfect harmony. He had been woken up around 5 in the morning, very annoying considering the rare occasions on which he actually slept, by Kido, who was carefully balanced on the railing of his balcony. Naruto had asked him the reason for his unwelcome visit, and Kido had responded with something that Naruto had been secretly dreading over the past few weeks. Sasuke had abandoned the village. Apparently, he actually found Orochimaru's offer appealing enough to agree to his terms and conditions without knowing them. Naruto scoffed. He had taken some time to process it all and the seriousness of the situation, because his first thought had quite literally been, what a relief. But he himself knew that he couldn't let this happen. Sasuke should never go over to Orochimaru. This could be the catalyst of something far worse. First off, it would mean that Sasuke would definitely get way stronger than he already was. Taking Orochimaru lightly in such cases was plain stupid. Second, well, he was his teammate. Yeah, right. He can't let his teammate just go to a strange snake man who offered him power. But, does that mean Sasuke was his friend? Naruto scoffed. Of course not. TCH. But somewhere deep down old memories arose. Of him and the Uchiha groaning at the random tasks. Of them fighting weak-ass goons. Of Sasuke occasionally supporting him. Naruto felt a weird empty feeling in his chest. And it seemed to grow larger. It wasn't like he considered Sasuke a friend, right? Then why did he feel this way? Sasuke could go do whatever the heck he wanted, why should he care? So he rushed to Kakashi-sensei and told him that Sasuke had left. Immediately, without even questioning him, Kakashi and the other Jonins dispatched the Genins to go after Sasuke. Naruto hesitated before telling them that Sasuke was accompanied by some of Orochimaru's underlings, because he hadn't come up with a good lie as to how exactly he found that out. Luckily, the situation had escalating pretty quickly and all he received was a questioning look without any questions. So here he was. Jumping ahead in full speed towards Sasuke. They had already encountered 3 of the underlings and those were pretty strong, but his teammates, Choji, Shikamaru and Neji decided to take them on, encouraging Naruto to go ahead. He had almost reached the Uchiha when a weird-ass guy with really pale skin and 2 red dots on his head showed up. I don't have time for this. Still, Naruto got into a stance ready to beat up this weirdo, but just then Rock Lee popped out of nowhere. Go on ahead, Naruto, Sasuke is your friend, save him. Save him, my ass. Yeah, thanks Lee, are you sure you can fight? Naruto asked, remembering how he had almost been killed by Gaara, because unlike other Genins, Lee had never actually done something bad to Naruto. Yes. Lee flashed him a thumbs up, Lady Tsunade healed me. Don't worry Naruto. Naruto gave him a small smile and nod and ran off. Surely Lee could handle that weird guy. He had to cover a large distance before he finally reached Sasuke again. That Uchiha brat had decided to run away on his own while Orochimaru's underlings took care of the Genins. He could hear the sound of water, does that mean the final valley? A remnant of an epic battle between the god of shinobis and the leader of Uchihas. 2 statues stood face to face, on either side of the waterfall. Madara Uchiha facing Hashirama Senju. Sasuke stood on Madara and Naruto on Hashirama. Are we really going to fight now? Or is he gonna run away again? Naruto was tired. Tired of Sasuke. Tired of running. Tired of trying to reason with him. He was tired of caring. This will be the last time I do anything for someone else. Sasuke. What the heck do you think you're doing, huh? He yelled across the valley. Sasuke didn't respond. Oh. Oh. Of course. He can't hear me. Why would he hear me? I'm just a nobody interfering in his business, right? He scowled. Last time. Sasuke. I know very well that you can hear me. Don't try ignoring me. It won't work, you know. He laughed. Anyways, I'm used to it. Finally, Sasuke looked up. Straight into his eyes. Why do you even care, Naruto? Good question. Now what would be a good Naruto-ish answer to this? Because you're my friend. Abort, abort, abort. Mission abort. Sasuke scoffed. Just come back already. Naruto yelled again. No. Sasuke replied. With that he turned around and was about to go when he was met with a kick from behind. Sasuke managed to block it and pushed Naruto away. What is your problem? Sasuke yelled. Naruto had decided that he wouldn't let Sasuke go. That's it. And so if words wouldn't work, he would have to use force. Don't force me to do this, Sasuke. Naruto warned as he got into a stance. Sasuke smirked. Naruto. Sasuke. They charged at each other. Kicks after punches. Naruto kicked Sasuke, but he grabbed his foot and twisted him in the air, flipping the blonde. Sasuke grabbed his collar and was about to punch him, but Naruto wrapped his legs around him and flipped him, so that Sasuke was on bottom. Sasuke did the same and flipped him again. Soon, they were rolling like idiots towards the edge. This continued and eventually, they fell into the river. Naruto didn't activate his chakra and fell into the water while Sasuke landed perfectly on his feet. Naruto had just emerged from under the water when he was met with a strong kick in his face, throwing him behind. Something had definitely broken. Naruto held his face in his hands and felt blood. Ha! Sasuke panted and then charged again. Just before he could punch Naruto again, Naruto went under and then came up from behind Sasuke, grabbed his stomach and pulled him behind. With his balance disturbed, Sasuke, too, fell into the water. Naruto grabbed his shirt and forced him inside, not letting him come up. While the Uchiha struggled underwater, Naruto got up and crouched on the water. He finally let Sasuke go, who came up gasping for a breath. Naruto stumbled backward. It was a serious situation, but he felt like laughing. There was blood all over his face. Sasuke was gasping and the whole situation seemed absurd to him. He was fighting Sasuke. To bring Sasuke back. Because Sasuke wanted to go. What? And so he laughed. He clutched his stomach and laughed, his face ached with the strain. He was still laughing when he received a kick in the stomach, throwing him back. Gathering his composure, he stopped laughing, or he tried. He wiped his face, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. Sasuke glared at him. The sun shone at his black hair, now wet. You think this is a joke? Sasuke spat out. Naruto looked at him. Into his eyes. They were dark and black. What was he thinking? A joke? Hell yeah. This was so stupid. Why was he even here? Why was he fighting? Why was Sasuke blaming him? Why was Sasuke going? Why was he stopping Sasuke? Because otherwise, Sasuke would get stronger and then destroy Konoha. He would take away the only thing that's yours. Your revenge. Oh yeah, that makes sense. Come on, Sasuke. Let's just end this and go back, okay? Everyone's waiting. Sasuke didn't bother listening. He ran towards him and used kunai to deliver several slashes. And from behind he shot a fire phoenix jutsu as well. But unlike the kunai attack, his second attack was defended against. Naruto had brought out his katana and used a wind jutsu to slash through Sasuke's attack. That's it. He backflipped and got in a stance, readying his Rasengan in one hand. Sasuke got the message and smirked. He held out a hand and readied the Chidori. They charged at each other. Naruto. Sasuke. A blinding flash of light as their attacks meet. They are both thrown backwards. But finally Naruto gets up. His healing capacity had always been greater than most people. He walked over to where Sasuke lay. "You pathetic piece of shit," Naruto growled. "Don't die." He tried picking him up, but he was too weak. He struggled for a while, but gave up. He laid there for a while. The sun was now high up in the sky. Noon already. He closed his eyes. "Need help?" His eyes flew open only to be met with a smiling face. "Kito." Naruto was so grateful. "Come on, let's get you guys back," he said happily, and another guy walked up to him. This one had dark red hair and had a man bun. He bowed slightly to Naruto and proceeded to pick up Sasuke. "Where's Hitomi?" Naruto asked. "He got on the back of Kito ans," he answered. "She's cleaning up after your friend's fight." Kito smiled. They ran at a faster speed than humans and preferred using the denser areas of the forest to travel. "This way, no one ever notices our presence," Kito explained. Before they reached the gates of the village though, Kito and his companion had to leave. Kito explained that Naruto would now have to continue his journey alone since the villagers can't see him with two random guys and all. With that they disappeared and Naruto dragged Sasuke back to the village gates. "God damn it Sasuke, you're heavy as..." Naruto panted. "As what dope?" Naruto looked back and saw Sasuke glaring at him. He stopped and let Sasuke walk, though he stumbled more than Naruto and looked quite beaten up. Unlike Sasuke, most of Naruto's injuries had healed and he was feeling much better. Sasuke's face was bruised, but he didn't seem all that angry and vengeful. In fact, he seemed like he was thankful that Naruto brought him back. "Hey, Naruto, thanks." Naruto was surprised. This wasn't unexpected, but not expected either. He flashed him a smile. Sasuke continued, If you hadn't come after me, then maybe I would have gone over to Orochimaru, and he would have taken advantage of me. And how can I hope to defeat that certain someone without my own power, right? I need to get stronger. But on my own." Naruto smiled. This wasn't exactly what he had meant to do, but fine. He smiled a little and was about to say something, but Sasuke fell limp again, putting his entire weight on the blonde. Was the Rasengan too much? Naruto wondered. They finally reached the gates and Naruto felt exhausted all of a sudden. He made out a pink-haired figure standing there and was about to call out to her, when she ran from where she stood. "Sasuke-kun!" Sakura screamed. That struck a chord in Naruto's mind. Sasuke-kun. Sasuke-kun. All the time. What about me? She ran to them and clutched at Sasuke, holding his face in her hands and searching for injuries. Many were found. "Can we at least enter?" Naruto was about to ask her when she cit him off with a slap. "You monster! What have you done to him?" she screeched. Still shook from that slap, Naruto only managed a feeble, "What?" in response. "What did you do to him? Why is he so hurt? Why aren't you hurt?" She was frantic now, as if he had broken her most expensive vase. "Are you?" Naruto began, about to knock some sense into her, but was once again interrupted by a random jonin. He came and without sparing a glance at the blonde left with the Uchiha. Naruto followed slowly after him, glaring at Sakura. "What does that stupid banshee thinks I did?" By the time they had reached the gates, a huge crowd had gathered. They were whispering, loudly enough that Naruto could hear every single thing they said. "I heard, it was the demon. They had a fight. Pretty sure that demon wanted to kill him. He has gotten stronger. I knew we should have killed him before. Or at least, locked him up somewhere. Yeah, he's too dangerous to be left." Naruto clenched his teeth and shut his eyes. He would have covered his ears as well, if it were useful. What did these people think? That it was his fault? How exactly? Who do they think was about to abandon the village? Oh right. That was the elite Uchiha. He can't do anything wrong. It was always Naruto's fault and it would always be. Someone grabbed his hand, and he looked up, startled awake from his thoughts. It was Kakashi. Where were you? I was looking for you guys, he said, dragging the blonde away from the crowd. He saw Sasuke also being taken away by a bunch of medical ninjas. He glanced behind and sighed in relief when he saw that Sakura wasn't allowed to come after them. They went straight to the Hokage's office while Sasuke was taken for treatment. They entered and the first thing he blonde noticed was the council of civilians. They sat there scrutinizing him, while Lady Tsunade held her hands in front of her, deep in thought. Lady Tsunade, Kakashi said, informing her of their presence. She looked up and made eye contact with Naruto. It was at that moment that everything clicked. It all pieced together in Naruto's mind. He was going to be blamed. For everything. He was going to be blamed for injuring Sasuke Uchiha. He was going to be punished. Severely. Why else would the Hokage be sitting with those no-good losers? Panic started building up in his chest. If you harm the villagers, then you might get killed. Wasn't that what the old man told him? Wasn't that some kind of settlement he had made with the civilian council? Were they really gonna kill him? He looked for a way out but saw Anbu around them. He was screwed. And he had no idea how to get out. Lady Tsunade sighed. She held her hands in front of her head and her eyes were closed. She seemed to be in deep thought. Probably thinking about Naruto's punishment. She sighed a few times, and then finally she sat back and opened her mouth to speak but was rudely interrupted by a middle-aged woman from the civilian council. The woman was fat and ugly. Just the kind of person who would rejoice in personally slaughtering Naruto. She banged her hand on the table and spoke in a loud fat lady voice, "Kill him already." This simple statement was backed by the rest of the council, which nodded and agreed. The lady smirked and turned to Lady Tsunade. She was met with a pair of fierce eyes that glared at her, and that was enough to shut the council up. Lady Tsunade cleared her throat once again and spoke, "Naruto Uzumaki. You harmed Sasuke Uchiha, didn't you?" Maybe, just maybe she would understand. Naruto held on to the thin thread of hui that he had, but still somewhere in his heart he knew it was bound to break. "No," he replied. He had just finished saying it when the Hokage banged the table and shouted at him to stop lying. Naruto was clearly taken aback. What was her problem? When did he do anything to her? Did he ever say anything to her that would have made her hold a grudge against him? Not that he remembered. "Lady Tsunade," he said in a small voice. This wasn't how he would have reacted usually, but she was Jiraiya's friend, right? Surely Jiraiya would have told her that he wasn't like how the villagers spoke of him. Lady Tsunade seemed to be having a hard time trying to decide what to say to him. Of course, it wasn't an easy decision for her either. She knew that Naruto was not a monster. She knew that the villagers were a bunch of liars. But she had responsibilities too. The elders pressurized her. The civilian council and the whole village was against this boy. What could she do? A legendary Sannin can't battle a whole village. Especially the one she was supposed to protect. But was it right to blame an innocent boy for things he hadn't even done? Of course not. This was something that she absolutely couldn't agree with. But then elders would demote her from this position and she would have no way of ensuring Naruto's safety. This put her in a tough spot. The civilian council grew impatient. A man stood and one of the Anbu stepped forward from the shadows. The man sat down. Kakashi stepped forward and spoke something to Lady Tsunade. She nodded and he turned to the council. The Hokage would prefer to talk about this with him in privacy. "Please leave," he declared. Naruto eyed the council as a ruckus exploded. "What? Absolutely not. We want to see it with our own eyes. What if you let him go? Yes. We need to be sure that he is punished in the exact way we declared. Execute him. Execute? A weird feeling rose within Naruto. His legs seemed weak, but enough to keep him standing. He felt queasy and feverish. He felt as if his whole body was hot and a thin layer of ice surrounded him. Kill him. How would you know what the demon did to our village? You just want to help him. You think he's innocent. We know you'll protect him. You're just a... Whatever the man was about to say stopped right in its tracks. Lady Tsunade had risen and had slammed the table so hard that it broke. She glared at each of the members of the civilian council. I will not execute him just because a bunch if nobodies don't like him, she said slowly. Kakashi frowned a little at her but then nodded. He grabbed each of them along with some other Anbis that had appeared and led them out. Now it was just Naruto and the Hokage. Naruto, she said again, snapping Naruto's attention from the fear of execution to the fact that he just might not be executed. He looked up. She looked at him with pity. That was when he knew that the alternative to his execution wasn't going to any better. What exactly are you planning to do? He finally said, cursing at himself for sounding so scared. A trial. She responded. A trial? What? Do you actually think that holding some sort of trial might actually help me? Do you really believe that literally anyone will have anything to say in my defense? What exactly do you mean by trial? Naruto shouted. Was this lady serious? What did she wish to accomplish by holding a trial? Naruto, you need to understand, okay? She seemed to plead. No. You're the ones who should understand. I didn't do anything. In fact, I helped you guys. I brought Sasuke back. He was going to abandon the village. Are you serious? He was going over to Orochimaru. Do you have any idea what happened? He was desperate now. She seemed like a reasonable woman, but she wasn't being reasonable at all. Tsunade stepped forward and put a hand on Naruto's shoulder. That shut him up because he knew what exactly she could do with those hands. This was probably her way of threatening him. So, he shut up. It seemed like once again he would have to be the one who had to adjust. He was always the one who had to adjust. Listen here, Naruto. I don't know much about Konoha. The people, the students, you. I have no idea. I know about you only because Jiraiya wouldn't stop talking about you. How you looked just like, how you were so talented, unlike what the villagers say. But I also know that you have the nine-tailed fox in you. And I know how scary it can be. Also, I have a lot of responsibilities. The lives of all these villagers. The responsibility of maintaining law and order here. Naruto couldn't help but scoff. Her grip increased. The elders are pressurizing me to go along with the civilian council. I managed to handle them by reminding them that the nine-tailed fox would be let loose. So now, they want to imprison you. I will do my best to do something that will grant you freedom. So this trial is the only thing I could come up with. Please, Naruto. Please understand. Unfortunately for the blonde, her words made sense. Eventually, in a small voice, he agreed. Konoha was bustling with people the next day. Everyone rushed to the Hokage Tower when the trial was to take place. What do they mean trial? Kiba asked as he ran over to Shikamaru. They are saying that Naruto tried to kill Sasuke-kun. Ino chimed in, her voice laced with worry, but the boys wondered for whom. They reached the tower, but it was already crowded. Where is he? I don't see him. Choji was straining to look up. He'll come later, I think, with the Hokage. Shikamaru replied. They somehow squeezed themselves into the front rows and sat. What exactly was this trial? Nothing like this had ever been held before. The crowd of villagers near the tower began hollering. 30 seconds later, sounds of glass bottles being broken and stuff being thrown could be seen and heard. Naruto finally came into view. The genins gasped at his condition. They were all aware of the villagers' hatred towards the blonde, but they were certainly not prepared to see him like this. He was being escorted by two Anbis who held him not so gently. And anyways, his hands were chained behind him. He was scowling at the villagers and glaring at everyone. Junk flew from the crowd, and while some missed, some hit their target. As he walked, another glass bottle flew out from the crowd and smashed itself right on his head, making him stumble. A few people gasped, but the blonde shook it off and whipped his head towards the direction of the bottle. He glared at that direction as if he had already found the owner of the bottle, which he had. When he began walking towards the platform, a trickle of blood from his head was visible. "That's too much," Sakura protested, causing a few people to raise their brows. But the genins still protested. They might not like Naruto, but this was unacceptable. Naruto walked up the platform where the Anbu chained him to a pole. He smirked and said loud and clear, "Isn't this a bit too much? Are you really that afraid of me?" The crowd stopped shouting. He looked towards the villagers and smiled again. It wasn't the usual cheerful, bright Naruto smile. It was the smile someone gave to a person they loathed. The villagers understood. And so a few started shouting again. "You killed our families. This is what you deserve. You murderer." They were joined by others, but it had no effect on the blonde. He just rolled his eyes and stood there lazily. Finally, the Hokage, accompanied by the two elders, appeared. She sat down facing the civilian council. The female elder announced the beginning of the trial. The complaints against Naruto Uzumaki. Lady Tsunade was yet again interrupted by the council. "Complaints is a mild word, Hokage-sama." The male representative of the civilian council spoke. Tsunade sighed and motioned for him to continue. "Here's a list of the crimes committed by the monster. 1. He destroyed Konoha." Tsunade interrupted him. "The nine-tailed fox destroyed Konoha." "Go ahead." The man scowled but proceeded. "He causes a lot of problems in the village. He tried killing the last surviving member of the Uchiha clan. These are some serious crimes, Hokage-sama." Tsunade sat back. "So you want to kill him because he apparently tried to kill Sasuke Uchiha?" "Apparently? When he came back with Sasuke, why wasn't he injured at all? From what we know, Sasuke Uchiha is the strongest genin, right? And the demon is at the bottom of his class. Then why, please explain, is Sasuke the one who is more injured?" The crowd roared in agreement. Tsunade turned to the elders and gave them a look. She then turned towards the man and said, "It was probably because of the Kyuubi." The crowd gasped. The genins muttered among themselves. Was this a good thing or a bad thing? "He has a name." Naruto muttered in low voice, but no one heard him due to all the noise. The man held up a hand and the noise reduced. He then gave a serious look to the Hokage and spoke his next words slowly and clearly. "That's exactly why we need to get rid of him." Before Tsunade could respond, the female elder spoke up. "Your concerns are reasonable. But we do not execute people, much less children, in Konoha. Also, you need to understand that killing him would cause the Kyuubi to go on a rampage." The civilian council seemed taken aback. This was probably not what they had expected. The thought that killing him would also cause the end of Kyuubi. A woman pulled down the man as they discussed their next move. Naruto couldn't help but laugh. "What? Not gonna kill me now? Come on, do it. Let's see how you handle the nine-tailed fox." He glared at the civilian council. "Stop making this worse, Naruto." Tsunade warned him. "Define worse." He snapped back. "This isn't how Naruto behaves." The genins thought. Tsunade replied, "Your death would be worse." Naruto let out another small laugh. "Death would be better than this public humiliation, you know." Tsunade glared at him. First, she had to deal with this civilian council, and now this stupid brat was acting up. "Just throw him out of the village," the man said from the council. "Yes. Exile him. At least you can do that much, can't you, Hokage-sama?" the lady next to him said, standing up. Slowly, the entire council stood up, agreeing. Even the crowd agreed. The Hokage and the elders discussed something among themselves. Then they turned to the council and nodded in agreement. The villagers cheered in delight, while the Genins could only watch. "Oi oi! Do I get a say here?" Naruto yelled in between. The council's faces turned sour as they turned to the blonde. "And what exactly do you want to say?" the man asked him. With a large smile, Naruto spoke, "Go to hell." The man, seriously offended, proceeded to slap the shit out of the laughing blonde, but was held back by the Anbis. Eventually the crowd dispersed and Naruto was taken back somewhere. He would have to leave the village the next day itself. It was past midnight, but the lights in the Hokage tower were still on. An angry, bandaged Naruto stood at the doors with his arms crossed at his chest, glaring at Tsunade. She had grown used to it and signed a last paper before looking up at the blonde. "Go get your things from your house," she told him. "You say house as if I live in a freaking mansion." Naruto grumbled, dropping his arms and rolling his eyes. "You know this is the best time for you," Tsunade told him, a low voice. What Naruto hated the most about her was how rational her arguments were. He couldn't think of a good retort to most of what she said. And he wasn't planning on making an enemy out of her. It wasn't like she was the one who hated him or had abused him in any way. She was by no means at any fault. And Naruto wasn't going to take out his anger on her. With a sigh, the blonde turned around and left. He walked slowly and carefully towards his flat, wondering if it had been ransacked yet. Surprisingly, it had not. With raised brows, Naruto entered the flat and cautiously looked around. If a huge man with a huge butcher knife came at him from the shadows somewhere, he wouldn't be surprised. Naruto sighed at his pathetic thinking. No. What was pathetic was his situation right now. Eventually, he found out that there was no one in his house. He slowly took out all the books that were kinda useful to him and stored them in scrolls. He zipped open his jacket and put on a belt on which he stored all his scrolls. A few moments later, he was done with storing his books. Next, he went over to his kitchen and stored all the essentials in a scroll too. All this time, he was muttering just one word: pathetic. He was exiled from his village because he saved an elite. What kind of predicament was this? Tch. After packing up whatever he thought he would need, he decided to leave, not before glancing back just once more. After all, this was the place that had sheltered him for so many years, even though it failed miserably sometimes. Naruto shut the door and locked it, smiling as he wondered if people would still try barging in and raiding this flat. It was still dark and almost the wild village was asleep. If he wanted, he could snap a few heads before leaving, as a goodbye gift. But he decided against it. He would come back later. And destroy everything slowly. Raze the whole place to the ground and make sure a few particular people suffered. He didn't go to the Hokage tower, because Tsunade never told him to come back quickly or anything. So he wandered off to the training ground. He saw the poles standing there and grinned at the memory of his first victory against Sasuke. The first time that Uchiha realized Naruto's true strength. He wandered around some more to kill time and only went to the tower when he saw the first rays of sunlight. A few Anbu were waiting for him and he roughly pulled him towards the village gates. Naruto let them, smiling smugly all the way. In fact, he let his entire body loose and put all his weight on the Anbis, making them drag him. This irked the Anbis, but they didn't say a word. Naruto commended them silently, professional, very professional. He was soon at the gates and was actually surprised to see a fairly large crowd waiting for him. The Hokage was there as well. So were the elders, council people, some random villagers and the genins. Naruto's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the Konoha 12. Or rather 10. Considering him no longer part of Konoha and Sasuke absent. The genins didn't say anything. Actually, they couldn't say anything because of the amount of influential people. A few shook their heads at this, while a few had sad looks on their faces. It wasn't like Naruto cared. He couldn't care less whether they came to taunt him or see him off. But it was interesting to see their reactions. The man from the day before came and motioned for the Hokage to exile him. Naruto prepared himself for some kind of incantation or speech. "You're exiled," Lady Tsunade said. "I'm sorry, what?" Naruto blurted before he could stop himself. He really wasn't expecting her to be this blunt. It seemed like the civilian council wasn't expecting him to be so dense as well. So the man stepped forward and repeated formally. "You are henceforth banished from the lands also known far and wide as Konoha. You are forbidden to return to the village ever again. This is the consequence to your actions, demon." He phonished haughtily, with his chin up in the air. The crowd clapped and cheered and Lady Tsunade only spared him a sideways glance. The Anbis finally released him. He turned to leave, as a voice from behind spoke up. "Don't try anything sneaky. We have our eyes on you." It was the old female elder. She was someone to be respected, but Naruto couldn't care less. "Why would you tell me that?" he asked, genuinely confused. His question even left the elder speechless. "What do you," she began, but was held back by the male elder. "Just go already," he said. And so Naruto left. A few days later in Konoha. The nurse came to check on the Uchiha and was pleasantly surprised to find him awake. "Sasuke-san." "Wait, I'll call the doctor," she said and rushed to find the doctor. Meanwhile, a groggy Sasuke slowly got up into a sitting position, holding his head in his hand. His head was pounding for some reason. He glanced around the room and saw a curtain partition. Expecting to see Naruto, behind it he drew it open. But to his surprise, there was no one there. Maybe he was discharged earlier, he thought to himself. Soon the doctor came and checked up on him. He smiled and told him that he would be ready to leave in a few days and went to call his sensei. Sasuke only nodded and went back to rest. He closed his eyes but couldn't sleep. His fight with Naruto kept flashing before him. "Sasuke-kun." A shrill voice pierced through his ears, and he only managed not to groan. He opened his eyes and saw Sakura sitting on a stool as she placed a fruit basket beside his bed. Kakashi stood behind her and gave him a polite eye smile. Sakura chatted for a while about how he was doing great, and he would get netter soon, and how the frights she had brought were so fresh, but Sasuke cut her off. "Where's Naruto?" Immediately, the atmosphere kinda dropped. He felt an awkwardness in the air and was able to guess that something major had happened. "What happened? Where is he?" Sakura flinched at his tone and got up immediately. She took a few steps back as if afraid he would lash out at her. "They exiled him," she blurted out. Her bluntness caused Kakashi to sigh. He stepped forward and looked at the Uchiha in his eyes, giving him a serious look. Sasuke gulped as Kakashi launched into detail about what exactly happened, but only after sending Sakura away. After he finished, Sasuke shouted with indignance, "But that's not fair at all." Kakashi nodded. "Sasuke, let me talk to them. I can explain." Kakashi shook his head. Jay placed his hand at Sasuke's shoulder. "You don't understand how political this matter is. Your testimony won't change anything." Sasuke pushed off his hand and glared at him. Finding himself unable to do anything, he simply covered himself with his blanket and told Kakashi to leave, which he did. For the next few days, until he was discharged, all Sasuke thought about was how and what he would say to the Hokage and to the civilian council. He also imagined what he would tell Naruto. After he was discharged, the first thing he did was rush to the Hokage tower, much to Kakashi and Sakura's annoyance. He was told that Lady Tsunade wasn't available at the moment, so he sat there waiting for her till nightfall. Eventually, when she arrived, Sasuke argued passionately about how Naruto had actually saved his life and he should be brought back. Lady Tsunade gave him a tired look and said, "I know. I know he was innocent." "Then why?" Sasuke raised his voice. Because Lady Tsunade raised her voice as well, tired of being treated as if she had no brains at all and being the center of everyone's anger. "I had no other options, Sasuke Uchiha. Maybe if you weren't so desperate for power, we would not be in this situation right now." She had struck the right chord, making Sasuke falter. He stopped in his tracks and looked down at the floor shamefully. Tsunade, after calming down a bit, spoke again. "You should understand that this wasn't my decision to make. In fact, he got off easy because I helped him. Do you what the entire village wanted to punish him by? Execution." Sasuke's eyes widened as he finally looked up. Now he felt even more guilty. "But I helped him out and got him exiled. At least now he has freedom." Tsunade spoke as she leaned back in her chair. "Can't we clear his name or something? Let him come back to the village?" Sasuke asked timidly. Tsunade shook her head. "Don't you want to start riots and civil war in Konoha? Don't you realize the repercussions of that? Even if we cleared his name, the villagers still hate him. Do you think the villagers despise him because he hurt you? They despise him for who he is. For what he is. They despise him for something that isn't even his fault. The incident with you at the Final Valley only gave them an opportunity to act against him and get rid of him." Tsunade stood up and walked up to him. "All we can do now is keep an eye on him. Maybe in the future we can think of some way to bring him back. You should get strong enough to do so and influential enough to change people's mind about him." She faltered for a moment. "If you consider him a friend, that is." Sasuke frowned. "Of course." "Good." That marked the end of their discussion. From that day forth, Sasuke Uchiha had changed. Not much, but significantly. Instead of only nodding and eyeing, he actually started talking. He also practiced more and didn't complain much. He made sure to shut the mouths which dared curse at Naruto Uzumaki. Slowly, with the loss of his friend, he had grown. Much to the surprise of the Genins. It had been a week since he had been exiled. And it had been a pretty good one. Except for the fact that he had ran out of food. "Did you really plan on living on cup ramen? In a forest?" "I thought it would last for at least a few weeks." Naruto replied sulkily, making circles on the ground near the last discarded cup if ramen. Sighing, he stood up, dusting his pants. The sky had darkened and there were dark clouds in the sky. Naruto walked towards the base of a mountain and walked up along a grassy path. He soon came to a small cave and went in to check it out. Finding it completely safe, he came out to get a bunch of wood for a fire and went in again. Inside, he dumped the wood on the ground and went to the mouth of the cave and covered the entrance with a branch he broke in the afternoon. He lit a fire and amidst the darkness, 2 pairs of eyes glowed. "Hey there," he said in a low voice. There were 2 foxes staring right at him. One had a smooth red coat that and glowing golden eyes, while the other one had a strange turquoise streaks. The shadows shifted and there sat 2 people. Kido grinned and spoke, "This is quite cramped, no?" He was sitting next to Hitomi with his arms wrapped around his legs, which were brought up to his chest. Hitomi glanced at him and sighed. She had a smaller figure but was sitting in a proper posture. Naruto laughed quietly, "Too broke to afford a cavern, your majesty." Kido waved his hand, eyes closed with a pained expression, "Today, I forgive you." He was smacked on the head by Hitomi. "Ah!" Naruto and Kido groaned together. It wasn't that Hitomi was a boring person, it was just that she couldn't keep the information any longer. Listen up, she said, her voice excited. We are. The boys replied. No. Kito. Shut up, man. Kito rolled his eyes, but quieted down. Okay, for real this time. Go Hitomi. Naruto said, all serious. Hitomi brought out a scroll from Kito's kunai pouch, making Kito frown at his pouch as if he had no idea it was in there. She opened it and showed Naruto a basic map of the area around Konoha. It was a hand-drawn map and below it was a detailed map of the area in which they currently were in. Pointing at the grove near Naruto's current location, Hitomi began. We have located 7 anbis. They are spread out during the night and only gather at noon. Their meeting spot is here. She tapped at the grove several times to emphasize the location. They meet for only half an hour and share info. What info? Today the brat had an extra cup of ramen? Naruto said as if offended. Hitomi scoffed, exactly my thoughts. But maybe they are noting down all your locations. And why would they do so? Naruto could think of a few reasons, but wanted to know their opinions as well. Kito spoke in a serious tone, what if in the near future you decide to do something, cause problems for Konoha and they have to look for you? They might check each and every spot you've ever been in. Naruto agreed with him, thinking the same thing. He turned to Hitomi, and? Hitomi huffed, what and? This is the information. You tell us what we should do and when. Naruto looked towards the entrance, thinking about the poor anbis out there. Tomorrow at noon. He said, smiling softly. Hitomi and Kito grinned and bowed slightly. They turned back to foxes and crept outside. Naruto watched them leave knowing well that they would never be spotted by the anbis. He slept well that night, imagining all the possible ways of slaughtering anbis. Next day at noon. The anbis quietly gathered at the base of the tree on the center of the grove. Their movements were so quick and silent that not even a single leaf turned. They sat together in a huddle exchanging whispers and notes. No matter how strong their senses were, none of them caught the change in atmosphere. How the birds had suddenly vanished. How it had suddenly become so quiet. A rustle of leaves caught the attention of an anbu and he calmly turned around towards the bush. He stayed there staring at the bush and had almost raised 2 fingers to his lips when a small red furry popped out. The anbu lowered his hand, thinking what the hell that was. Another anbu peeked out from behind him and said softly, a fox. It's just a baby. The small fox had tumbled onto its back and struggled to get up. Finally, with much difficulty he rolled back to his feet and then, after licking its feet, sat down right there under the hot sun. The anbis retreated slowly. They couldn't trust anything. Something's not right. An anbu suddenly spoke up, getting out his kunai. Another guy stared at him. I've never heard of foxes in the forests, never. And my family has been hunting here for many years. The anbu replied, his tone a bit shaky. The other anbu rolled his eyes, you always make such a big deal out of everything. Relax, it's just a... Unfortunately, he wasn't able to complete the sentence. And he probably never would. He had been sliced through vertically, splitting into 2 pieces. The other anbis couldn't help but look on in horror. What kind of steel blade is even capable of this? They froze for a few seconds, but regained their composure. It was impressive, after all they were anbu. Anbis had a special reputation among all the villages for being quick to respond and stealthy. Not many had encountered anbis, and so even less information was available on them. But right now, despite their qualifications, they weren't doing so well. A young man with red hair and was crouching near the corpse, head lowered. He held a long katana in his hand and had a strong physique. One of the quicker anbis stepped forwards and trying slashing at him with his water jutsu, but the red-haired guy simply stepped to the side and lifted his head up. He smiled evilly at the Anbis, with just one side of his mouth curving up, displaying his canines in the broad daylight. The Anbis rushed forward to attack him, each with their own jutsu. One tried to blast at him a fire jutsu, which was easily blocked by the enemy's katana, and as he turned, another Anbu aimed at him neck with shuriken, which is dodged by ducking. These shurikens lodged themselves on the face of the Anbu behind him and he screamed in pain. They finally came to a standstill. The red-haired Jai was in the center, behind him was the Anbu whose face was buried in shurikens. There was another Anbu with him who helped him remove the shurikens while the other four surrounded the enemy. "Who are you? Which village are you from?" An Anbu to his right shouted. The young man slanted his head at him amusingly. He narrowed his eyes as if he found something funny. He bent a little, causing the Anbis to react by reaching out for shurikens, but all he did was greet them with a deep bow. He stood up straight and introduced himself. "I am Kido. Nice to meet you." His eyes flashed with humor, unnerving the Anbis. The guy behind him had finally removed the shurikens from his face and was being healed by his teammate. "What's your problem with us? Who sent you?" he yelled. Kido glanced back and smiled again. "I don't have any problem with you." "He does." Before the Anbu could ask another question, a katana lodged itself in his chest, pinning him to the ground. The guy who was healing him widened his eyes in shock and looked up the tree, from which the katana had suddenly appeared from. His eyes widened even more, and before his teammates could save him, a shower of kunai rained down on him with such immense force that they all went through him and pinned his through the ground. The high sun illuminated all the grass that had now turned red. It glistened in such a way that it was almost mesmerizing. 3 of 7 were already dead, and they had no idea who the enemy was. They didn't know the number, they didn't know their village, they didn't even know their intentions. It seemed that this guy, Kido, only killed them to pass the time. The remaining Anbis looked on in shock. Suddenly, they heard soft sounds of something landing on the grass all around them. They slowly looked around them and discovered that they were completely surrounded by foxes. Black, gray, orange, red, they were in many colors. They weren't sure about how many colors foxes could have, but they were sure that foxes couldn't be that big. They stared in shock and could only gather in the center. They stood back to back, breathing heavily and taking in the vast number of foxes on this forest. I thought he said there aren't any foxes in the forest." An Anbu asked, cowering slightly. "They're just animals. It's all right." Another tried calming him down. Kido stood near them, looking at them pitifully. "I thought Anbis were supposed to be fearless or something. Are you already shaken?" he asked mockingly, resting his katana on his shoulder. Of course the Anbis were shaken. They weren't the most experienced ones, nor had they ever seen someone die in such a gruesome way. Hell, none of them had even seen someone die yet during a mission. They had been given this mission just because it didn't have much work regarding fights and was only based on collecting information. They shifted closer, and Kido stepped forward. He scoffed, "I at least expected y'all to put up a good fight. This is boring. Are you gonna do something? Or should I just kill you?" The Anbu facing him glared at him and spat at him, unable to come up with a good response. Kido still smiled, but his eyes had darkened. He let out a small whistle. The Anbu who had so turned his head around to his right suddenly, only to be engulfed by a strong jaw. The Anbu beside him jumped away and watched on in horror as a black fox crunched into his face, crushing the skull with a crunching sound. After tearing it out, the fox chewed as a faceless body fell down limply. Blood trickled down the glistening fur of the fox, which Kido patted, wiping off the blood. He looked the scared Anbis and licked the blood, grinning. The Anbis had never encountered such a horrific situation. Positive of the fact that he was going to die here, an Anbu rushed out and charged at Kido. Maybe he wasn't paying attention, or he was so angry he didn't notice. He ran right into a trap, invisible chakra thread that had formed a net between Kido and the Anbis. The poor guy was sliced into small pieces before he could even unleash a jutsu. Kito laughed. Pathetic. There only remained 2 more Anbis, and it didn't take long for Kito to slice their heads off. But before killing the last one, he made sure to let him look at the person behind this. His eyes widened as the last thing he saw was a blonde kid standing in the shade amongst the foxes, his blue eyes as cold as ice. The grove was silent once again. Nothing much had changed actually, except for the color of the grass. 6 months later. The sound of swift running made a rabbit's ears prick up, right before it jumped out of the way as 2 ninjas ran over where it was standing just then. They jumped onto trees, their footsteps never faltering, as their black robes billowed against the wind. The wind blew in their faces along with heavy rain, causing the ninja with blonde hair to click his tongue in annoyance. Fucking rain. He sweared. The guy behind him tried covering his face, but to no avail, and started wailing. This is so bad. So bad. Why are we stuck here? What is happening? Shut the hell up, Toby. Let me think. The blonde guy switched trees and Toby followed suit, just in time to dodge several shurikens infused with so much wind chakra that it sliced the branch from which Toby had just escaped. Seeing his close call, Toby wailed again, Daidara. Do something. Toby sped up and now jumped alongside Daidara. You have a plan, right? Tell me you have a plan, because if you don't have a plan, then even I don't have a plan, and then we both will die, and then leader will kill us. Daidara. Toby rambled. Shut the fuck up, of course I have a plan. Daidara roared. He then proceeded to tell the plan to Toby, whose eye had begun watering, either because of the situation or because of Daidara's shouting. Listen, Daidara begun in a low whisper, we know this area, right? So we know that there is a clearing over there, okay? So we're gonna run from whatever that thing is and we'll head to the clearing. Then you know what to do, right? Tony sniffed, run? He asked innocently. Daidara smacked his head, not run away, he whisper shouted, towards the enemy. Lead him to me and then leave it to me. Daidara nodded confidently and whirled around. There were several kunais heading their way, and so Daidara blasted them away. He turned and grabbed Toby's collar and then released several small spiders at whatever that was following them, and ran as fast as he could. He reached the clearing just as several explosions shook the forest behind them. They stopped at some distance from where they came through, waiting for the enemy. They made it a point to look around them as well, considering the fact that the enemy could appear from anywhere. But to their surprise, it was from the center of the smoke that their enemy appeared. They were so quick that Daidara had no time to process his entry, and was pushed aside by Toby, who was stabbed straight in the chest. Daidara stumbled back and stared for a second. He noted the long yellow hair and the small size. Orange and black jacket, face yet hidden. Ah, who cares? Daidara fired small clay bombs at the blonde boy, who widened his eyes in surprise. Blue. Daidara noted. Daidara held back a laugh. Of course, the kid was surprised. First his attack went right through Toby, and now Toby's partner was aiming for him by aiming at his partner. How could someone do this right? Ha! Stupid boy. Daidara grinned as the bombs went right through Toby and blasted in the kid's face. Wah, he stabbed me, he stabbed me. Toby ran around wailing. Daidara smirked, Toby, you're fine. Good. He would have said, work, if the boy hadn't gotten up. Daidara narrowed his eyes and Toby hid behind him, peeking at the blonde kid. The kid sat up, holding his face in one hand, while the other held a katana. The kid was bleeding quite a lot from his head, and that was normal. What wasn't normal was the fact that he was still alive. Especially considering how every bomb blasted straight into his face. His blonde hair was of shoulder length and hung in front of his face as well. Half of his head had turned red from the blood and his face was also covered in blood. Despite that, the kid got up and smiled. Nice. He said, impressed. And that ticked off Daidara, Who the fuck was this kid, trying to fight them, still on his feet and having the audacity to say, nice, to them? Nice? What do you mean nice? Of course it was nice. It was magnificent. It was art. Deidara yelled in rage. Toby nodded as fast as he could, agreeing with Deidara's every word, even though he didn't actually agree. But still, even when faced with clearly two dangerous criminals, the boy laughed. So, it's you, he said casually, with a lazy grin. He didn't notice the small white clay spider that had climbed towards his neck. Deidara narrowed his eyes at him and snapped his fingers. The kid blew up, leaving behind no signs of his existence. Wow! That was fast, Toby said, clapping his hands together. Deidara-senpai is so awesome, he squealed. Deidara smirked at the smoke and swiftly turned around to leave. Toby followed after him. He had only taken a few steps and reached the center, when some sort of barrier lifted up around them. It was bright orange and covered the entire portion of the clearing. Deidara whirled around, eyes glancing over at every corner and spots of the forest. He forced his hand into his clay pouch and took out a big chunk of clay. Dividing it into two, he made one into a bird and the other into a big bomb. He let the bird fly up to find an opening from the top, while he threw the bomb at the barrier. The bomb exploded with a large explosion, but it was futile. The barrier didn't budge. Is this an enemy attack? Was the boy a bait? Did he sacrifice himself? Deidara? Toby stuttered as he walked backwards towards Deidara. TCH. I have no fucking clue, okay? Deidara said, backing up as well. Both teammates now stood back to back and tried spotting their enemy. Deidara looked up just as the clay bird exploded above them. Shit, he said. No escape, Toby said, a tear dropping down his mask. Not unless the enemy tries fighting us, Deidara said, suddenly grinning. With the rustle of bushes towards their right, their heads whipped in that direction. They saw a small movement from that direction and had almost seen its cause, when the barrier suddenly started coming closer. Deidara and Toby stood in shock as the barrier shortened to an area of around 1 meter around them, forming a neat square. Out of thin air, 4 blonde kids like the one he had just killed appeared at each corner. What the fuck? Deidara was taken aback and Toby held him from behind. Where'd y'all come from? He questioned. The blonde kids looked up at him with a weird-ass grin. It's called genjutsu, old man. One of them spoke. But you just died, Toby yelled this time. At the same time, Deidara yelled that he was not an old man. The boys rolled their eyes and replied monotonously, dude. Ever heard of clones? Deidara finally realized. And he glared at the boys. So I don't suppose the real one is among you? They shook their heads. I'm here. A voice came from behind them. Deidara and Toby turned around. The blonde was standing there smiling. But that wasn't what they found weird. He was bleeding from his head, and his clothes were torn. So it wasn't a clone? Deidara asked pathetically. He thought he had figured out this kid's trick, that he had used clones before, but this blood was definitely real and he was the one Deidara had blown up, but then how come he didn't die? The blonde kid sighed. I am so disappointed in you too, he said. Deidara held back a curse. It was me before, and then you exploded those things right in my face, and so I was compelled to switch my position with a clone and it took my place. A good move considering that trick you pulled off, right? He smiled and tilted his head towards the side. Deidara held his chin in his hand, imagining what he had said. I don't get it, but it makes sense, Toby said, nodding like a sage. Deidara looked up at the kid and finally noticed the Konoha headband. It had a horizontal slash along the leaf symbol, displaying his status as a rogue ninja. The fuck did you do to get kicked out of your village? Deidara questioned. Naruto looked surprised for a second but then exclaimed silently and touched his forehead protector. Not much, he said. Deidara raised an eyebrow, making the kid sigh. Fine, I'll tell ya. I saved this guy. The blonde kid trailed off. And? Deidara snapped. What do you mean, and? That's it. That's all I did. The kid spread out his hands defiantly. Deidara was surprised. The fuck kinda reason is that? Konoha is a tough place to live in. Toby nodded sagely, still holding his chin in his hand. Deidara had had enough of this kid and his bullshit. What do you want? If you're a rogue ninja, then you shouldn't be interested in causing trouble for yourself. If you had any allies, they would have been here by now. And if you were a spy, you wouldn't have taken such risks or told me all that shit. The blonde kid nodded, as if pleased by his observation. Wow. Nice. So you do have some brains. He knew he was ticking off Deidara and yet he continued. Deidara knew he wanted a reaction out of him and that was why he was provoking him. So to deny the kid that pleasure, Deidara didn't respond. The blonde kid shrugged, let me join you. Toby and Deidara's neck whipped up. They didn't know whether to laugh or what. What? The kid spoke innocently, did you not understand? Are you dumb after all? Fine, I'll repeat. Let me join the Akatsuki. Deidara's eyes flashed with anger. What makes you think we're in some group? He snapped. The kid laughed. Oh. I dunno. Those flashy robes? Toby spoke up this time, what if we both are just a couple and like this robe? Deidara smacked Toby's face, injuring his hand on the mask. But he whipped towards the kid again. Who told you? No one. Where'd you hear the name? Nowhere. Then, how do you know? So basically, I was right. I mean, I am right. The kid smirked. Deidara walked towards the barrier wall and slammed his fist on it. Not a crack. Of course. Hey old man. Take it easy yo. That annoying clone of this kid spoke up. Deidara stood there and thought. He thought for quite some time. This kid is good. But that's just because we weren't prepared. No. That's not an excuse I can make. If I brought him to the group, he might be a great asset. And if he tries anything, they can get rid of him. Especially that other guy from Konoha. Fine. Deidara declared. What? Toby interjected. I said fine. Maybe he can be useful. If not, then, Deidara trailed off, hoping the kid would get what he meant. Ah, really? You're so nice, Deidara senpai. The blonde squealed just like Toby. Deidara stared at him as if he'd grown wings. Toby's jaw dropped, of course, they couldn't see it. The kid pouted, and placed his hands on his hips. What? I thought you were into this kinda stuff. Deidara shook his head as if he couldn't believe this was the kid who defeated him. But then he looked back at Toby and thought better. Then let's go. The kid said. Yeah. Sure. Let me just step over this goddamn barrier. No. Deidara scowled. The kid squinted his eyes at Toby. Well, I dunno about you, Deidara, but I'm pretty sure Mr. Mask could have done that. Deidara raised his eyebrows and then turned to Toby. Could you? He asked. Toby started sweating. I dunno. Toby doesn't know. Deidara shook his head in defeat, knowing that if Toby didn't want to tell him something, then he wouldn't. No matter what. Eventually, the blonde lowered the barrier and the clones vanished. That cheeky one left only after calling Deidara, old man, once more. They began their journey to. Hey, where do you guys live? Like, where's your hideout? The kid asked. Deidara sighed, I don't. Fucking. No. Okay. We need to wait till the leader contacts us. Deidara was so done. First Toby and now this brat. So basically I'll be traveling with you for a while, huh? The kid asked, and Toby nodded. Deidara suddenly realized that this kid hadn't introduced himself. And there was still blood on his head, though it had dried by now and he didn't seem to be bothered by it. So he asked, "Say kid, what's your name?" The blonde turned to him and grinned. He placed both his hands behind his bloody head and spoke, "I'm Naruto Uzumaki." They had been literally roaming around and doing nothing for about a month now. And Deidara was pissed. He wasn't the sonest man on earth, but even he couldn't survive Toby and the new kid, Naruto. They were the most horrible thing that had ever happened to him. He glanced behind and immediately regretted it. Naruto had his katana out and was trying to stab Toby, but Toby kept dodging like a seaweed. Deidara raised his eyebrows in alarm. "Stop. What the fuck?" Naruto lowered his katana and rolled his eyes. "Oh come on Deidara-senpai. You're such a boring old dude." Toby nodded vigorously in agreement but halted as soon as he felt Deidara's glare boring into him. Deidara stomped towards Toby. "You fucking traitor. Why the hell are you supporting him? Is he better than me? Ha!" He barked into Toby's mask. Toby held up his hands in defense. "No. No. It's not like that. It's just that." Toby replied meekly. "It's just what?" Deidara barked. Naruto just stood at the side staring unimpressed at this dramatic duo. He raised his brows, waiting to see what Toby would reply with. "It's just that, you're blonde." Toby finally stuttered. Deidara stared at him blankly. And Naruto choked on air. He knew what was coming. He knew Deidara would say, "We're both fucking blonde, you dipshit." Deidara yelled. After that he just gave up. All he could do was walk. Blessed are those who have brains. After a lot of pointless walking, the trio finally reached a village. "Hey, isn't this like, somewhere around the grass village?" Naruto questioned, as he shielded his eyes from the sun. Deidara shrugged, "Well, yeah. We're supposed to eradicate 2 villages in this area." Naruto raised a brow and Deidara smirked. "What kid? You thought we provided blankets to the needy?" Naruto shook his head and crossed his arms. "No. I just don't understand why you'd want to wipe out such petty villages." Toby jumped in, "Well, that's because it's our job. That's what we do." Naruto was surprised. "Huh? What? You take orders from someone else?" Deidara groaned, "Yes. Where do you think we get funds from?" Naruto smiled as he let out a soft, "Ah. So you need money, maybe you hadn't bought such fancy coats for your members you would've." Deidara blasted a small spider near his face before he could argue any further. With that he stomped towards the village. Naruto rushed behind him laughing. "Ah, come on Deidara-senpai. Okay, fine. When and how do you plan on eradicating them?" Naruto said as he slung an arm around the grumpy Deidara. He pointed towards a figure in the distance, carrying a pail of water to their house. Toby walked behind them and responded happily, "Well, Deidara dropped some big bombs on them and done." He laughed happily. Deidara glanced at Naruto, who for some reason was sulking after hearing Toby's answer. "What?" Deidara barked, "You don't approve of our methods?" Naruto let go of his shoulders and buried his hands in his pockets. He didn't seem happy at all. In fact, he seemed as if someone had just scolded him. Deidara wanted to ask him what's wrong, but he didn't want to seem like he cared for this brat in any way. So he took his time to stare at him instead. This kid was smaller than him, but had a strong physique. His hair was quite long and messy, as if he never cared for it or cut it. It was almost shoulder length now and even fell in front of his face. His jacket seemed to be too short for him, and he always kept it open, never zipped it. He wore a white shirt underneath, but even that seemed really worn out. Deidara sighed. Why don't we get you some new? He was about to change the topic when Naruto interrupted him. Deidara, let me take out one village, he said briskly. Deidara was quite surprised at his serious tone. Why? Tobi questioned. Naruto threw his head back and smiled. Ah, your methods are too boring. It was Deidara's turn to raise his brows in an excuse me, what did you just say look? Naruto smiled innocently. Tobi suddenly popped up in front of him though, and yelled, H. Boring? What do ya mean? Naruto laughed again, making Deidara frown at him. This wasn't a normal laughter, he could sense an underlying madness beneath it. Deidara stopped him. Naruto was beginning to annoy him. What the fuck do you mean, huh? Deidara asked in a low voice. But to his surprise, Naruto didn't even flinch. He just tilted his head and replied, I mean that, your methods are too boring. Deidara grabbed his collar. Care to explain in detail? Are you going to teach me how to do my job? Naruto held up his hands apologetically. Oh, absolutely not. I'm so sorry. I just thought that the Akatsuki would be more fun. I mean, killing people with bombs? That's too quick, isn't it? Deidara found himself staring into Naruto's blue eyes. He felt a weird creepy sensation, and so he let go of his collar. This kid is crazy. Naruto stepped back and smiled apologetically again. I'm sorry. You can do your thing, my opinion doesn't matter, haha. But please, could you let me do one village? Deidara stared at the kid. He wasn't much younger than himself. Finally, he sighed. Tobi and I have already planned this out. But a part of the village extends into the woods. You can take those out. Just finish it on time. Naruto's eyes seemed to light up. Deidara frowned. Even if he was a criminal, he didn't do these things because he enjoyed killing. He only did what he was told. It was purely a job. But this kid seemed as if all he wanted to do was kill. Every time something related to killing was mentioned, Naruto would seem to light up. This guy might be as much of a psychopath as Hayden. Well, I better go check out my area now. Naruto waved at them and without waiting for a reply went away. Does he know the timing? Tobi asked quietly. Deidara didn't remember telling him. Soon the kid returned. By the way, what time? Naruto climbed swiftly towards the village in the woods, face still red from embarrassment. What was he thinking rushing into a random direction like that? Did he want to be cool that desperately? He groaned as he ran his fingers through his hair. He had been doing that quite a lot lately. He held his hair in his fingers in front of face to estimate its length. It had become quite long. He should try to maintain a good appearance in front of the villagers. He turned around and went towards a stream nearby. He washed his face and wetted his hair. It still looked like a mess. So he just pressed them all back and then wore his headband. He touched over the Konoha emblem and sighed. He had managed to put a slight genjutsu on it, to make it look like slashed headband, but in reality he just couldn't bring himself to that. It pissed him off, but he managed somehow. He got up and walked once more in that direction. Soon he reached a small secluded village deep inside the wood. If there were no trees, he could definitely see the other villages from here, since it was also quite high up. He didn't bother introducing himself, he just went around and started talking to the villagers. They, being the clueless innocents that they were, offered him food and whatnot. He talked and laughed with them, as it came easy to him. It wasn't hard to figure out what the person wanted to talk about and what were their likes and dislikes. In fact, Naruto excelled at this. He had picked it up in an attempt to make friends and maintain a good image in the public. All fun and games only lasted till sunset though. As soon as he saw it had started becoming dark, he said his goodbyes and began leaving. The villagers were nice enough to offer him a room at night, there are dangerous animals in the forest at night, like wolves and foxes. They said. Naruto smiled, I know, and walked away. The villagers went to bed peacefully at around 10, thinking about the nice blonde boy who had visited them. They were so pathetically unaware of the eyes surrounding their small settlement that Naruto only barely managed not to laugh out loud. He sat on the roof of a house, waiting for Deidara to begin blowing shit up. A loud bang resonated within the forest, shaking the trees. Ah, Naruto's eyes gleamed. At this point the villagers should have awakened and would be rushing out. And he was right. There were barely 7 to 10 families here. Not that he minded. And they all gathered towards the edge of the clearing to see what was happening. What's happening? Everyone whispered to each other, trying to get a good look through the thick woods. Naruto couldn't help himself. He started laughing again. How pathetic can someone be? The villagers suddenly turned around as another bomb exploded in the distance. They looked around for the source of the laughter, mixed with the screaming of the residents of the burning village. Finally a girl pointed towards the roof of a house. You! A woman, who had given him fruits in the afternoon, spoke slowly. Hey there! Do you like the view? Naruto asked cheerfully. Did you do that? An older man spoke up, sounding panicked. Naruto got scared. Of course not. Why would you think that? I'm right here, ain't I? So are you going to save us? You're from Konoha, aren't you? The woman from before asked. She was cradling a small baby who was crying. Naruto tilted his head slightly, still wearing that smile, but the way his eyes glinted in the fire's light was enough of an answer. But why? What did we ever do? A young man yelled. He was around Naruto's age, maybe more, who knew? I dunno, man. It's a job. Naruto shrugged. What the heck? Why? What's your problem? Didn't we treat you well? The young man had lost his temper and would have tried charging at him if not restrained by an older man. Yusuke. Don't. The man told him furiously. Let go, uncle. I will kill this guy. Yusuke yelled. He probably would have yelled some more, but before he could blink, he found himself face to face with a pair of cold blue eyes. Wah, he stopped, feeling something drip from his lips. He tried looking down with his eyes, without moving his head, and was shocked to find a kunai at his lips. It wasn't digging into him or anything, but the sharp edge was against his lips, and a slight moment would result in a gruesome sight. Your yelling is annoying. Naruto spoke in a low voice. Yusuke trembled and found himself sweating. All his vigor lost. Naruto smiled. That's a good boy. He then turned to the woman and glanced at her baby. He then looked at the woman, whose eyes widened in realization. She tried her best to hush her baby, and even went as far to cover his mouth and face. But it was of no avail. The baby only started screaming louder. Naruto slowly walked towards them, cleaning the blood from his kunai and wiping it on his jacket. The woman was crying as well now, scared for herself and her child. As she saw him approach, she held her child closely to her chest and stepped away. Please don't. She begged. Naruto raised his kunai, but a man jumped in the middle, on his knees. Please, please leave them alone. Please. You can do whatever you want to us. Please. So pathetic. Tch. Naruto threw them a disgusted look and raised his kunai anyway. Yusuke yelled and the kunai lodged itself in his throat. The blood sputtered from his neck, as he gasped, coughing blood. All the villagers around him either stepped back in fear or were frozen in shock. A few people even screamed but then shut their mouths with their hands. Naruto strides towards the bleeding guy, and grabbed his collar. Couldn't you have just stayed quiet? Did you have to scream? You brought this upon yourself, buddy. He was about to let go, when he remembered something. Oh, and you asked me, why, right? Well, Who the hell is so trusting? Why would you feed a stranger? Who told you to be nice to me? Why did you do anything for me? Ha! It's all your fault. You shouldn't be so naive, okay? Next time, don't do this, Yusuke. With that, he closed the boy's eyes and yanked out his kunai. Blood spattered over his shirt as well as his face. He wiped it, but that only spread it more. It was a truly horrible sight. As he got up, the villagers were made painfully aware of the shadows in the dark. A bunch of eyes lit up and stared at them. The foxes. A girl whispered, and she clenched her mother's dress while her mother only stared in shock. Even the bomb blast seemed distant now. Alright, who's next? As Deidara and Toby walked up the woods, they came across several blood splatters all around them. On trees and rocks and grass. Deidara looked at them and frowned. Even Toby seemed confused. What the fuck happened here? Deidara whispered to himself. As soon as they came to the clearing, they were met with only 3 to 4 houses. And it was a bloody mess. Where is that freak? Deidara muttered. He was answered with a kunai at his feet, and so he looked up. He tried to ignore the fact that the blade was still red and dripping. Naruto sat on the edge of a roof, grinning. It would have been a very normal grin, if his clothes and hair were not matted with blood. He looked as if he had rolled around in a pool of blood. Toby picked up a hand that was lying around. Where did the bodies go? He asked. Naruto jumped off the roof and pulled back his kunai. He wiped it on his jacket, making another bloody stain on it, and put it back in his pouch. Eaten. He said nonchalantly. Deidara was appalled. What kind of fucking psychopath EATS people? You fucking ate them? He yelled, eyes wide with shock. Toby was staring at Naruto too. What? No. Of course not. What do you think I am? A psychopath? A cannibal? No. The animals ate them. Naruto replied defiantly, throwing his arms around in wide gestures. Deidara wiped off the cold sweat that had formed on his forehead, and he decided to leave this matter. There was no point in arguing with a crazy freak. Fine. Never mind. Leader will call us in a week now. He told them. Naruto's eyes lit up. Really? That's awesome. How is your leader? At this, Toby interjected in a casual way, oh, he's so boring. After that, as they left the bloody site, Toby and Naruto continued gossiping and back-bitching out people, while Deidara had to worry about their newest member. Would the leader accept him? Well, he does his jobs, and even though his methods were quite different from Deidara's, he still made sure that there was not much evidence left behind. What did he mean by animals though? Summoning Tekuhiko? Maybe. Deidara sighed. This kid was trouble. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed this what if and want to see next part of it, comment down below and let me know. Also share this video with your friends. See you in the next video. Peace.